This is so cool. Good evening. We have this beautiful in Santa Cruz Wednesday evening that has been and will be held by a weekend of 27 people receiving the precepts in our Jukai ceremony, and the graduation of a beautiful group of chaplains who are here among us. And this is the first time the chaplains have been back at Upaya since the pandemic. And it's just such a joy. And they're pretty happy about it. Really, really a joy. Really a joy. Yeah. And is anyone here visiting us for the first time? Oh, nice. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome. It's always a beautiful thing to be somehow found by visitors and local people, and I hope you come back. So before bringing up the emptiness teachings, which is something that we've been exploring over these past few weeks, and before talking about compassion and skillful means and not knowing and not turning away and ancestors, and before bringing up and bringing in some of the fear alive for us now in our time and how to be with that, I want to start with a really beautiful story, which is a story of a man who grew up with the Yurok Indians on the Pacific coast of what's now the United States. Because it's about walking in beauty, and and then I'm going to read a poem, and then I'm going to talk more directly about the Dharma, but you will hear with your Dharma eye that the story of the Yurok people is a Dharma teaching completely. And you know, we just chanted that Dharma is vast and subtle, and some of these teachings, I feel like you have to kind of slide in sideways. You know, you can't just drive a truck through them, or, you know, they are subtle and they need to be lived into and approached in many ways. And poetry is always a good way, and storytelling. So, I don't know how many, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we were visiting the territory of the Yurok people, and I came across this book, and then in beginning to read it, found out that Harry Roberts, who wrote this book about his experience as a boy and young man growing up with the Yurok Indians, spent the latter part of his life at Green Gulch Farm. And he actually was a good friend of Wendy Johnson's, who we know from there. So he was born in 1906, which is kind of surprising that he could have been around, you know, still when Wendy knew him. He was from an Irish-American family, but his father went to the Pacific Northwest to work with the native peoples canning fish in a cannery. And so Harry got to grow up in this beautiful little pod of, you know, young Indian little brothers and sisters and fish and run around and roll in the dirt. And he was taught beautifully by a Yurok elder and medicine man who he called uncle. And he was trained from childhood in a traditional Yurok way to become what they refer to in the book as a real man, and what I'm going to refer to as a true person, because that was actually, we have a little other kind of sideways connotation when we hear real man, but what they deeply meant by it was a true person. And described as an independent person whom others can depend on, independent in that way, as part of the community, but someone whom others could depend on. And he also followed an important tenet of the Yurok Indian ethics, which I'm going to read twice slowly. It's just amazing what you'll hear. So this important tenet of their ethics is that one's real self and purpose in life. And then they say, real self and purpose in life, they are one and the same, is a manifestation of the indescribable, which Harry called creation or pure beauty, which Norman Fisher calls love, and which is their way of describing reality as it actually is. A manifestation of the indescribable, which is reality as it actually is. And the story that I want to tell you is about Harry when he was a child. And there's a little chapter called Brush Dance Wand. And so he was being mentored by this elder, and I think when I imagine this story, I picture him as maybe 8, somewhere in that little boy category. So he would hunker down and learn and watch and help his uncle, is what he called this elder. And one morning, his uncle was making, very carefully repairing this wand, this brush wand for the dance. And so Harry sat down beside him and was watching him just work with such care and precision. And one of the brushes that he picked up, Harry said, "Well, that one looks perfect. That doesn't need to be fixed. And plus, it's going to be dark in the dance field. Why don't you just skip that one? No one will know." And his uncle said, "Well, I'll know." And so at that point, his uncle said, "I think I'd like to begin teaching you, giving you lessons on how to become a true person. And so I want you to tell me what this is that I'm working on." And Harry said, "Well, it's a wand." And then his mentor, whose name was Robert, said, "Well, I'm going to be asking you some questions so that you can learn about the law." And the law, as he understood it, was one law. And that law was, be true to thyself. And so little Harry said, "Well, I understand that. There's only that one law, and it's quite simple. Be true to thyself." And his uncle said, if you understood that, then you wouldn't have asked me why I was repairing this brush wand. And so the story goes on. It's such a beautiful little teaching as well of the way the teacher works with him. So he says, let's start over. What are you holding in your hand? And so Harry says, a wand. And his uncle goes on working, and then he goes out to chop wood, and he's silent, saying nothing. Then he goes to the river to fish to see that if he can get some fish for their breakfast. And he comes back, and he hasn't said anything. And so little Harry asks him, why won't you speak to me? Have I offended you in some way? And his uncle says, no, I just didn't want to offend you by interrupting your thoughts. And Harry says, well, I answered you already. And so out of kindness, his uncle asks him again. And then the boy thinks, and finally he says, okay, it's a head wand for the last night of the brush dance. And then, trying to get the answer that he thinks his uncle really wants and trying really hard, little Harry says, it's to show how rich you are, because it's the best and most expensive of all the wands in the river. And so poor little Harry really fell off the cliff and into the river with that answer. And it was a day or two before his uncle came back around and said, well, I see that you're just a small boy, and out of kindness, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this wand really is. And I want to read this little paragraph because every time it just makes me so happy when I read it. He was really trying to say what he needed to say to become a real person. And he was really failing. And so he says, I was only a small boy. And so I just cried and ran and cuddled up to my dog and told my dog how hard it was for a little boy to have such a great man for an uncle. And my dog understood and licked my face all over, and especially my ears. And then his uncle says, if your ears are now clean enough, perhaps you can listen. And then, he talks more about what the brush dance is, which is a dance that's done with for a person with a sickness. And I'll read this little part about the dance and also that also conveys the teaching that's really at the core of this teaching about repairing the brushes. He says, on the last night of the dance, everyone brings out their very best costumes. These costumes represent hundreds of hours of very careful work. They're made of the rarest and most difficult to obtain materials. They've been kept in absolutely perfect condition. Never does a costume ever show any wear or that it has been used before. Everything is perfect. These costumes are the most beautiful things we have. Thus, when one dances before the sick person in costume, it means that the dancer has cared enough for the patient to go to all that trouble in the hope that he can help. How could I respect myself if I only went halfway or 3/4 of the way to help someone? If I'm not going to help all the way, it's better that I don't go to that dance at all. So when I make a brush dance, the patient knows that I am all of the way for him. And thus he feels reassured and will likely get well. This is what the brush dance wands represent. This is the way to be true to yourself. Now, let's see if you can think like a true person the next time we have a question. And Harry writes, then it was that I saw that the law was not quite as simple as it appeared. I realized that to be a true person meant to be proud to yourself in everything. You could never be less than all of yourself without breaking the law. I want to read the tenet of the Yurok Indian ethic again. One's real self and the purpose in life, they are one and the same, is a manifestation of the indescribable, what Harry called creation, pure beauty, reality as it actually is, prajna. So now a poem, and then the straight-on Dharma, but first a poem. And this poem I want to especially send out or dedicate to the chaplains and to those who just received Jukai. It's Ada Limon, and it's called Instructions on Not Giving Up. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crabapple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs, shoving their cotton candy-colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains. It's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets, leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath, the leaves come, patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us. A return to the strange idea of continuous living despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it all. Instructions on not giving up. So I want to pause here. And thank Roshi and all of my teachers and all of you, because we're in this together. And all, as I said, of the Jukai recipients and the chaplain students and anyone who's spending their Wednesday evening sitting here together, looking at how we might want to live our lives, actually. And thank Kodo, who put us on this path of studying the Prajna Paramita teachings. So what we've been dipping into, there's many, many of these sutras and emptiness teachings, but we started with the earliest one. And it's the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. And I have in front of me the beautiful Sanskrit, which I am not going to try to pronounce because it would not be kind to you. But this is thought to be the first, earliest Prajna Paramita Sutra, and it was written in about the 1st century. And I also want to acknowledge my sources as I, was looking into this material. And besides the sutra itself, I studied, Norman Fisher has a beautiful essay in his book called Beautiful Snowflakes. And it's one of the clearest writings on emptiness, to me, how I could receive it, that I'd ever read. And also a commentary on the Diamond Sutra by Musong. So those are some of the places I looked to try to see what I could say, what I could bring together that would make this material matter, come alive, be something to learn from and care about. And I'm going to start with a quote from Norman Fisher. They say that wisdom, or prajna, the faculty that cognizes emptiness and compassion, are like the wings of a great bird. And this is a very common image, wisdom and compassion holding us up. Holding both in balance against the wafting winds allows you to float, enjoying the day. When Norman says, really though, the 2 wings are 1 wing, where you can appreciate the flavor of emptiness on the tongue, you know immediately that love is the only way, and that everything is love and nothing but love. What a pleasant thing to hold in mind. All problems, all joys, all living, and all dying, it's love. So the very first thing I wrote yesterday as I began pulling this together was this. And this is the first thought that came to me thinking about the emptiness teachings, which is, what if all the heads of countries, all the bosses, and all the pirates, and all the fathers and mothers, and all the bureaucrats, and all the lonely ones, and all the hungry goats, the manipulators and liars, what if they knew, felt, and understood that we are all one body? What if that were true? Ignorance isn't not knowing, but it's misknowing. It's misunderstanding the nature of reality. What if they understood that every child to whom they deny food and medicine and well-being and safety was completely, wholly, undeniably their own child? In fact, a part of who they really are. And then this other consideration. What if all the mothers and fathers and caregivers and reformers and those who struggle against injustice and the doctors and nurses and campaigners felt, knew, and understood that, as Dogen writes, impermanence is Buddha nature itself, the ongoing process of one boundless and fluid body of sickness and health, living and dying, flowers fading and weeds growing, life arising and ceasing. Then their love and service could be easeful and filled with joy. And this is ultimately the gift of Prajna Paramita, of that understanding of reality, basically, how things really are, knowing that in the deepest sense. So this ignorance or delusion that's, classically talked about in Buddhism is misunderstanding the nature of reality. And it's why we practice and why we teach and why we vow to wake up and to live from this understanding of no separation. It's why we sit in meditation, to find out for ourselves and really, in the deepest sense, know this, that we're not separate. So something that Norman brings up in this essay and reminds us, there's this beautiful metaphor of Buddha, and actually Buddha said this of himself, that he saw himself as a physician and not a philosopher, and that his job was to heal. Norman says, yes, and there can be no healing without the basic, there can be no healing within this basic misunderstanding of reality. There can be no healing within the illusion that we're separate. And so our spiritual practice is coming to clearly see that this is a misunderstanding of reality, and to learn to live and accept the truth of how things actually are, which Senko described last week beautifully as an unremitting, unpredictable flow. And this learning to see through this misunderstanding can be a long road, because we really think and experience ourselves as separate. So we defend and attack and extract and suffer and cause harm. And the root of this suffering is this very misunderstanding, that we're these separate, independent beings. So the perfect wisdom teachings are for us not to just philosophically wrestle with, but they're integral to healing. They're integral to our healing. So slowly waking up, or sometimes fastly waking up, I don't know that part, I'm a slow waker-upper, but this path of waking up to this reality and seeing again and again our interdependence and the empty nature of reality kind of allows us slowly to live into a felt sense of the mutual identity of samsara, or the phenomenal world, and its delusions, and the transcendent. And to really get in our gut that these are two sides of the same reality. And as a result of really knowing that, compassion naturally arises, because we have compassion for ourselves and for all beings caught in that misunderstanding, caught in that delusion of separateness. And so, because of our awakening, because of the Bodhisattva's awakening to our inseparability from this fabric, this deep fabric of everything that exists, is motivated to use skillful means to awaken other beings. Norman writes this about the emptiness. We are, and this means that there's no moment in which we can be separate and apart, torn from the fabric of reality. We are always connected to past, to future, to others, to objects, to air, earth, sky, every thought, every emotion, every action, every moment of time has multiple causes and reverberations. This is still Norman. This is why I'm quoting it, because he's such a poet. tendrils of culture, history, hurt, and joy that stretch out mysteriously and endlessly. So the only thing left, the only real dynamic is connection. And for me, there's nothing more encouraging and uplifting than this teaching, because it means that everything I do, every relationship I engage in, permeates through space and time. And this is a really deep motivation for not giving up, basically, and for living by vow. Resting in the emptiness teachings, we can be in the world in a way that's not desperate, that's not clinging, but is deeply caring. And that's part of that tension with the emptiness teachings. But because we know we're not separate, we know there's no place and no person that's beyond my concern. Doesn't matter how far away. I have till 6:30, right? Perfect. So I do want to say a couple things. One is through our practice, we can begin to untangle this thing that seems so paradoxical about the emptiness teachings, which in a nutshell is we're saving all beings, we're vowing to save all beings, knowing there are no beings to be saved. And it just stops the mind. It's like, stops us in our tracks, kind of. If all existence is empty, then to whom do we direct our compassion, and why, and who cares? There's this kind of deep cognitive dissonance that arises, for me at least. And I think what I would say about that is good. Because that tension between wisdom and compassion is not to be resolved theoretically or understood conceptually. It's really has to be experienced in our body and mind, in glimpses, again and again through our continuous practice. So focus on upaya, on skillful means, to kind of bridge this incompatibility of emptiness and compassion. And I was reading that and I was like, okay, how is this so? How does skillful means bridge those things? So you're in the emergency room. You've worked to save the lives of dozens of people, and some have died. Does that make the life of the person before you less important? What we love is life and the being before us, and we engage completely and wholeheartedly as the true persons that we are. And yet, in attachment, flowers fall, and in aversion, weeds grow. Our friend Harry Roberts, in Walking in Beauty, has poems sprinkled through, and he writes, "In all innocence, the avalanche consumes the valley." In all innocence, the avalanche consumes the valley. So we hold this vast view where universes expand and collapse, and also carefully remove the snail on the path to the zendo so that nobody steps on it. And we honor its life. On the back of the rakasus that Roshi put around the bodhisattvas receiving Jukai's neck, was written, giving life to life. And that's really just been kind of echoing for me. And that's what Uncle was doing when he was so carefully repairing this brush for the brush dance. And it's what we do when we move the snail. We just take care of life. This is the spirit of our practice. Our commitment is to a lifetime of practice, to not giving up, to moving through doubt, determination, coming back to faith in the Dharma. It's just a lifetime of practice. And it's slow, at least in my case. It's been very slow. But I think that's the nature. I think that's the nature of what we sometimes call Dharma rain. So I want to share two things as I end this talk that are actually from the Prajna Paramita Sutra of 8,000 lines. And the first one is a simile of water drops. Water drops fill a water jar drop by drop, gradually from the first incidence to the last one. Just so, the first thought is the initial cause of supreme enlightenment. Gradually are the bright qualities fulfilled in the Buddhas. And then a second passage from the Prajna Paramita, 8,000 lines. How a bodhisattva helps beings. Or could be a subtitle, how a bodhisattva helps beings and enacts being a true person. Giving, morality, also patience and vigor, the concentrations and wisdom should be turned over into enlightenment. One should not grab at enlightenment, having considered it belonging to the skandhas. It is thus that it should be demonstrated to beginners. Coursing thus, the oceans of qualities, the moons of the doctrine, become the shelter of the world, its refuge and its place of rest. The means of salvation, the intelligence, the islands, leaders who desire its welfare, the light, the torch, teachers of the foremost Dharma, imperturbable. They are irreversible, immovable, and steadfast in their character. Being thus endowed with Dharma, unimpeded, freed from hesitations, perplexity, and consternation, intent on what is beneficial, having heard the perfection of wisdom, they do not despair. They should be known as incapable of being led astray by others, as irreversible. Here is Harry Roberts' Yurok teaching of a true person, an independent person whom others can depend on. And I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to end with another Ada Limon poem, and then we will bow. This poem is called What It Looks Like to Us and the Words We Use. All these great barns out here in the outskirts, black creosote boards knee-deep in the bluegrass. They look so artfully abandoned, even in use. You say they look like arks after the seas dried up. I say they look like pirate ships. And I think of that walk in my valley where Jay said, "You don't believe in God?" And I said, "No, I believe in this connection we all have to nature, to each other, to the universe." And she said, "Yeah, God." And how we stood there, low beasts among the white oaks, Spanish moss and spider webs, obsidian shards stuck in our pockets, woodpecker flurry, and I refused to call it so. So instead, we looked up at the unruly sky, its clouds and simple animal shapes we could name, though we knew they were really just clouds, disorderly and marvelous and ours.